Thank you for listening to the Allender Center podcast. I'm Dr. Dan Allender.
And I'm Rachael Clinton Chen. We're fiercely committed to providing hope and healing to a fragmented world.
And restoration for the heart.
Thank you for joining us. Let's get this conversation started.
Well, co-host, last year, several men began talking about what we wanted and hoped that women would know about men's sexuality, what we wanted men to know about men's sexuality. And we've had many requests to address this from the standpoint of women. So may I have you introduce our guests?
Sure. Well, we are really privileged today to be joined by our senior vice president of the Allender Center.
Our boss, bottom line.
Our boss, the one and only Cathy Loerzel.
Hello.
We are also really privileged to be joined by Christy Bauman,
who just launched a new baby, in this case, a book.
It might have been as hard as launching a baby. I don't know, a real one.
Well, it's a gorgeous book. Becky and I had the privilege of being able to write the foreword, and it's a book on the theology of the womb. So a very righteous book and a good book for us, at least at some point soon, to engage on this podcast. But given our topic of the day, I just want to invite you three women. I will be delighted to join wherever you think might be helpful. But what do you want men to know regarding a woman's sexuality that often you have either the sense that men either don't know, or if they do know, they can't keep it before them for some reason, not a lack of intelligence, not a lack of memory, but for some reason it's too difficult for a man to know this regarding a woman's sexuality?
Well, I'm really grateful that we have Christy here because she apparently is an expert about theology and bodies and women's bodies. So I'm actually just here to learn from you, Christy.
Oh, great.
Because I feel like that I'm very curious as to what you'd have to say.
That was a beautiful deferral.
It was. I loved that. But Cathy, I'm ready. Put me in, coach. I am ready. I feel like this probably even explains that women aren't allowed to really think a long time and reflect about what they want men to know, because in a sense, whether it's patriarchy or what has made it so loud in the sexual room is what a man wants, or that is our understanding. And I think women, as helpers or as the partner, we want to be good at what we do. And so I think we haven't really thought long and hard or known how to articulate what we want men to know about it, because we're usually thinking about what he wants or how we should bring that. But I do tell a story that I think about a lot, which is in a small village in Africa, there are many women who come together, and right before a wedding ceremony, the grandmothers and the mothers come in, and they are to show the brides 2 to 3 sexual positions that offer pleasure. And the reason this is so important is because they believe it's important for a woman to feel pleasure in sexuality. And they said, this is very different than the Western culture. The Western culture is, I have something you don't have. I have something that can make your husband more happy than you can. My body, the cleavage I show, whatever it is. So there's this sense that there's jealousy at the root of Western women's sexuality. And so we don't share the importance of female pleasure or the importance of helping our sisterhood understand pleasure either. And so I think women are at a bind. When we think about what do we want to tell men, we're also thinking we haven't had the luxury of exploring our sexuality without becoming objects. And so we're always wondering what we look like as an object before we're thinking about what we actually desire for the other to know. At least from my experience, that's been true.
Well, and I think you throw in, I would be curious how many of our listeners have had exposure to the purity movement of the 90s. And in some ways, I know there was really good intention behind that, but then you throw in the confusion of you're actually receiving spiritual formation that's telling you, oh, women, you are very dangerous in your sexuality, but also you only want emotional connection. You won't really deal with lust or arousal. Your primary role is to arouse, and you're totally responsible for the arousal of men. So if they are aroused, that's your fault. If they're not aroused, that's your fault. And I often talk about how confusing it was for me as a young teenager to, in my church context, be told constantly, put a t-shirt over your swimsuit, you're causing the men to be aroused. But then my friends who were like, well, nobody's telling me I'm causing anyone to be aroused, and how confusing it is to then want to be an object in order to be seen as beautiful and sexual. And those are really confusing waters to navigate.
Exactly. Yeah. They don't make room for you to explore what actually your body is telling you and what it was possibly made for. And we don't have much of a theology of what our bodies are asking for or supposed to bring to the sexual encounter.
Yeah, I mean, I was also in the purity movement. I actually ran that for my high school. So we all did True Love Waits cards, and I had 500 high school kids sign it. So for those of you who know me because of my influence at Oakton High School, you're welcome. But in all honesty, I think there's something about that movement where those of us who did step into it with a ferocity that we took on to other parts of our lives, there is a sense of shutting something down that would have been a natural movement for me to have known something of my own arousal structures, of my own body, of what brings pleasure both in my body and to other people's bodies that was stinted, and then asked to all of a sudden come alive when I was married. And I think that's I don't know that that's not a thing that men struggle with as well, but as I've been having conversations with lots of women, that's been a consistent theme for those of us who were in high school during the 90s or the 80s. And then that sense that all of a sudden you're supposed to flip a switch and then all of a sudden be, a tigress in the bedroom and know all of the things and have all of a sudden, history that goes along with your body that was closed off to you for so long. And now all of a sudden it's meant to be fully functioning and alive. And I think that's, so if I think about men, I would want men to know something of women's journey through that, if that's their story. A lot of women, that's not your story. And, that this is a foreign concept to you, and now you're Googling it on your drive. That's fine. But for those of you that is part of your story, and I think especially for women who have a history of sexual abuse, there's also this sense of a lot of deep ambivalence around both what your body can do and is meant for, but then how do you actually step back into that in a way that has honor, that has playfulness, that has delight. There's so much ambivalence around your body. If you have any history of psychological sexual harm or actual physical sexual harm, that is impossible to just override. And, from what I've seen, there is a sense or almost a demand for women just override that instead of actually being tended to in the midst of it in order for there to be delight and flourishing. And I think that's been categorized by a lot of men as frigidity, as not being, interested in sex. And that's not true. We've just never been tended to and never been given the option to actually tend to hearts that have been harmed and wounded. And then I think when you put that up against male fragility around their own sexual expression, well, that's a disaster.
Yeah, because I have to say, listening to the podcast, I think it was surprising to me. It shouldn't have been, but the kind of vulnerability I feel like the men brought to us around how much insecurity they have, how much shame and contempt and hiding they have. All of that makes sense to me, the fragmentation, but I don't think I had not heard men talk about their own anxieties about their bodies, their own stories of their bodies. And, my husband and I were listening to that actually a week after we got married on our drive from Seattle to Philadelphia. And it brought up really stunning stories about telling the stories of our bodies. And I think I would want men to know that also as women, it's not just the sexual parts of our bodies that hold story. It's like so many parts of our stories hold so many parts of our bodies hold story. And what does it mean to be tended to be curious about each other, to want to understand like a history of touch or a lack of touch, And I think I'm really grieved by what you're saying, Christy, this sense, because it feels really true. Like there hasn't been space to even get to be curious. And that feels really heartbreaking.
Well, and as a man, let me see if I can put a phrase or two and then have you respond to it. In so many ways, patriarchy and some degree of misogyny has created a context for millennia in which women are seen to be dangerous, to be the fault of a man's arousal, or the fault of a man not feeling that a woman's aroused enough. And so in one sense, you bear fault no matter what. And not only that, but you have to bear a certain degree of not just confusion, but almost this contradictory craziness of too powerful, not powerful enough, with too much presence, not enough. And is that a fair...
Yeah, I wish you could see our faces. Listeners, you can't hear, but we are all winking and nodding and be like, yes, that feels true.
So what do you want a man to know about that sense of craziness that you have lived with probably since even before you had a sense of what it means to be sexual, let alone in the adolescence, young adulthood, and it doesn't really end in most occasions. Just the podcast that Cathy and you and I did a while back about a woman being a leader. There's so much ambivalence, so much danger. So again, what does it feel like to have to live with this craziness and this sense of danger?
I mean, I as soon as you say that, I start to feel tired.
Yes. Yeah. Yes.
And a sense of, I don't know. I just feel sad. My husband and I we've been married for 9 years, and so sex isn't a problem. Just kidding. Honey, I love you. But there is, even like last week, there was a moment where I was needing a certain tenderness around, I had kind of suggested let's, hey, the kids are in bed early, maybe we should watch a show and then have sex. This is weird talking to Dan Allender about, but it's fine. No big deal. But it was this moment where I then, the show was over, the show had some intensity to it, and for some reason my whole day had kind of dropped on me while we were watching the show, and I was no longer feeling frisky or really wanting to have sex. And I kind of dropped into this place and realizing that now I'm in the category of I've offered something, now I don't really want to anymore, but now there's a sense of I don't want to recant, because now that brings up more, history around our relationship and when sex has been offered and not, all those things that are true in marriages. And I kind of turned to him and said, look, I understand that you're going to be disappointed. You're going to start to panic because you're just going to feel like I'm pulling something away from you that was offered. But I actually need you to tend to me in a different... I'm not saying that sex is off the docket for sure, but I need something's happening for me, and I need that to take precedence over the sense of you anticipating something that you're wanting in terms of physical connection. And it was hard. He was able to tend to it. But I think what I say, why I bring that story is because it feels complex sometimes for men to engage that, and it's not actually as complex as you think. To tend to a woman's heart can be really sweet and sometimes very simple. And it doesn't have to be something that shuts you down. It can actually be an invitation to truer, better intimacy, better sex, better places of relating, if there's a sense of being able to actually enter into a place that feels more complex to you. And it doesn't have to be much, even a sense of honey, okay, tell me about what happened. how did your day hit you? How is that manifesting in your body? Just looking at me in the face and offering tenderness and containment and attunement, that opens me up. And I won't say, universally all women open up like that, but I think probably most people do pretty quickly when I'm tended to.
Well, I think it's pretty well known that care is one of the most arousing things in the world. It's why we have to be careful who we offer care to, because it awakens our hearts and it awakens our bodies. And not universally, right? Because sometimes care is used in grooming, it's used in all kinds of things, but there is a sense like our bodies know they're made for good care, and they do unfold. I think what I hear you say that, Dan, I do feel the complexity in the bind of, for me to be in my body, here's what I want men to know. Like your fear around my fullness, around my femininity, around my beauty is actually not my work. And I feel like what women need to hear is, I think this is somewhat what Cathy's offering very graciously, is this sense of, as women, we need you to be men committed to doing more work around your fear, around your own stories of engaging female bodies. Because I think we're fond of beauty, but the reality is we're really scared of it. And when a woman is like embodied and loves being in her body, no matter what it looks like, it is one of the most beautiful things in the world. And I just feel a sense of like, I'm willing to be with you in your work, but I can't actually do that work for you.
And not only not do the work, but I don't want to be blamed for you not doing the work and using my perceived lack of desire for sex as actually an excuse to keep you from having to do that work. That's what I hear as a therapist, as a friend, when I hear women in their heartache. Women are far more sexual in some ways than men are. And yet that is such a reversal of our cultural expectation and actually demand.
Christy, I'm curious where you would weigh in on this given your work.
Well, your story was so close to my last night to the T that there's no need to tell the story but there was such a similar experience for me. I'm getting ready to leave on a trip tomorrow. I feel the pressure that I need to have sex with my husband before I leave. And I don't know if that's just the expectation or the inherent thing that's going on inside of me. I also know I'm about to start my period any day, so there's a lot of pressure, and I'm tired. I'm at the end of the day. I've been with 9 clients, and my heart is not there with him, and I have that conversation. I need to be cared for. And I feel sad, and I feel exhausted. And then to be seen, though, is what I need, and to trust that he is not only going to do his own work, but that it's okay. And, so that happens last night, such a similar story, and there's kindness, and we don't have sex, and then I wake up this morning, and I start my period, and I think, well, we're not going to have sex tonight. There's just something in my mind but I'm relieved, and I text him, and I say, I feel relieved in a sense that I don't have to face all of these expectations I put on myself, or I presume you're putting on me, or I presume the world is putting on me. And I just want to be loved and love you and be safe. And I think sometimes it gets so much more confusing than that, or it gets so confused whenever sex is communicating that simple truth. So that's good.
Well, if we have but just a moment or two left, if the issue, at least in part, is expectations, demands, but also that sense of, can you own your own desire, even if it's disruptive to what your spouse desires? I mean, that feels like a common, unique reality for all of us. But if you add that layer of feeling the demand and having to be the responsible but powerless person, crazy at some level in the culture and in the nature of the relationship with your spouse, it's asking of you so much more. And yet what I'm hearing you say is, come on, gentlemen, it can be a whole lot more simple than you wish for it to be as to whether or not you're going to know, engage, honor, but also be honest about your own life and story. Is that a fair way of summarizing?
Well, and I think just it piggybacks on the conversation that the men had. I heard really similar desires for a deeper level of connection, a deeper level of care, a deeper level of curiosity. And I did just want to, as we come to a close, just also name that, in some ways my energy I felt wasn't really even directed towards my husband, because I think our sexuality plays out not just in our marriage relationships, but in our interactions. And so I felt that kind of like, brothers, like, I need you to do some work because we're here. We're not going away. And we got to, in order for like the kingdom of God to unfold in the way it's meant to unfold, and for the work that we need to do in this world, like we've got to bring our embodied selves to the table. And so I just wanted to name that. And I think just what you're saying, Dan, like, yes, like just that sense of, I think we actually both want the same thing. And in some ways, the structures have actually set us up to feel very at odds with that, because we might come to them differently. And we might have different cultural stories of what our bodies have borne in those spaces. But I think that's a very accurate assessment.
Well, the next episode is, what do you as women want women to know and engage regarding a woman's sexuality? And why don't you put words to what my co-host said to me?
We're going to kick you out, Dan.
Yeah, and I say to that, I truly thank you, Jesus.
See you next time. The Allender Center podcast is produced by the Seattle School of Theology and Psychology.
If you'd like more information about the Allender Center, you can look at theallendercenter.org.